morning, everybody. I'm Karina Corrigan. I'm Deputy Chief Curator and the H.A. Crosby Forbes Curator of Asian Export Art here at the Peabody Essex Museum, and we are so delighted that you are here this afternoon for the second in our Salem as Muse series. This is the brainchild of our Chief Curator, Petra Slinkard, and this series is allowing us to focus on individual works or groups of works in PEM's collection that tell fantastic stories about Salem. Salem as Muse is a program that is just one of the many exhibitions and programs that PEM is offering as part of Salem 400 Plus's year-long commemoration of both the city's 400th anniversary, but also, of course, the 250th anniversary of the nation. You can learn about a lot of that, certainly at pem.org or from the info desk right here in the atrium. Before I introduce today's speaker, I also want to invite you to take a moment later today to visit our newly reimagined East India Marine Hall, which opened just less than 2 months ago and is a really spectacular reinstallation of PEM's foundational collection. And you have only 2 more weeks to see Edmonia Lewis set in stone, the first retrospective of an extraordinary 19th century Black and Indigenous female sculptor. I think that you will learn a little bit more about both of those installations as well as Salem stories in Paula's lecture today. So I'm delighted to introduce to you my colleague and friend, Paula Bradstreet Richter, Curator at Large at PEM, for this second in the Salem as Muse series. Paula is a specialist in fashion and textiles, American decorative arts, and American New England history and culture. She currently leads PEM's partnership with Handwork 2026, presented by Craft in America, which is another one of the national celebrations for America's 250th. And you can learn more about the fantastic self-guided tour that Paula has created in conjunction with Craft in America at pem.org. She has served as the curator or co-curator for over a dozen exhibitions at PEM, including Salem Witch Trials, the latest iteration of which you can see today, Made It, Women Who Revolutionized Fashion, Wedded Bliss, The Marriage of Art and Ceremony, Rare Bird of Fashion, The Irreverent Iris Apfel, and I should particularly note that Paula is one of the primary drivers for why we are the permanent home for Iris Apfel, Rare Bird of Fashion's collection. And Painted with Thread, The Art of American Embroidery, a catalog that if you can find, you must scoop up because it is out of print and it is really an extraordinary deep dive into PEM's American embroidery collection. And that's just a small sampling of many other exhibitions to which Paula has contributed. Prior to joining PEM, she worked for the Cape Ann Historical Association, the Sargent House Museum, and Landmark College. A graduate of the University of New Hampshire, she has published 2 books and over a dozen articles highlighting her research. Today's talk, Lucy Cleveland, author and textile artist, is just one example of the phenomenal research skills that Paula wields with great care on many aspects of PEM's collection. Please join me in welcoming Paula Bradstreet Richter.
Good morning and welcome. So pleased that you all could be here today on a holiday weekend and a busy time in the year. And I did want to say how pleased I am that this lecture is part of the Salem 400th Plus commemoration this year, and one of several lectures that my colleagues and I will be presenting over the course of the remainder of the year. I did want to comment about how I got started on researching this particular artist. and it goes back to the 1990s. And I brought with me a few publications, but in, let's see, what year was this? This was 1994, so just after the Essex Institute and the Peabody Museum of Salem merged to become the Peabody Essex Museum. My former colleague, Dean Lahikainen, who was the curator of American Decorative Arts, worked on this and developed this exhibition called In the American Spirit, Folk Art from the Collection. And it surveyed a lot of local artists, a lot of self-taught artists, an interesting array of artwork in many different media. And at the time, I was a newly minted assistant curator of American Decorative Arts. And so Dean assigned to me to work on certain parts of the collection alongside him. So I did the textiles, I did silver, I wrote summaries, I wrote draft labels, and then I handed it all over to Dean, and he rewrote some, edited others, and acknowledged my contributions in his catalog. But that is where I got started on Lucy Cleveland. That was soon followed. At the time, I realized that, like so many projects as a curator, at a certain point in time, you have to stop research and you have to produce your exhibition and your book. And so I felt at the time that I handed my notes over to Dean Lahikainen that I wasn't done with this artist. I could see there was more unexplored, particularly in the Phillips Library, the museum's research library. So I continued researching and eventually developed for the Dublin Seminar of New England Folklife, which was a conference and symposia focused on New England, and particularly New England folklife, that went on from, I think, the 1980s through the 90s into the early 2000s, and every year they published their proceedings. So I gave my first scholarly paper just a few years after the first exhibit at the Dublin Seminar for New England Folklife, which was hosted by Historic Deerfield out in western Massachusetts. And that gave me the opportunity, with some help from the Phillips Library director, then Director William Lemoy, and another library staff member, Jane, who helped edit my very first paper that I presented there in 1997. And then a few years after that, I continued the research. I still wasn't done. And I sent in a request to the magazine Antiques. Interestingly, my research had revealed that in the inaugural issue of the magazine Antiques in 1922, they produced an article on the Essex Institute, and an author wrote about what she called playthings from the past. So she categorized Lucy Cleveland's work along with dolls and other playthings. And so in the year 2000, I returned to the magazine Antiques with a request to consider would they publish an article on Lucy Cleveland. And so I did do that in the year 2000, and I brought my copies, so if any of you are interested, I can show them to you after the presentation. So now I'm going to turn to Lucy Cleveland, and I feel like she is a highly creative individual whose life story and artistic expression in literature and in visual art really grapple with massive changes in New England, cultural changes and historical changes in the first half of the 19th century. Lucy was born in 1780 and she died in 1866. And consequently, her lifetime spans the years between the American Revolution and the American Civil War, a very interesting time period. The Cleveland family was a very active and influential maritime family based in Salem, Boston, and Lancaster, Massachusetts. And she really crafted for herself a lifetime of creativity over several decades. Beginning in the 1820s, she began publishing children's books, and she really worked in two media, her authorship of children's books, and then also textile and mixed media sculptures. And these draw on her own life experiences and offer insight into domestic lives and the local community, and particularly the lives of seafaring families. In her second media, which is really the textile artistry, she applied sewing skills, artistic skills that were commonly taught to girls and young women into a visual medium that allowed her to convey ideas and to depict narratives in a 3D presentation. Her small sculptural vignettes, which are doll-like, they are all about 12 inches high. But they depict narratives, so she's still doing storytelling, but in a 3D form. And at the times, her figures were sometimes called figures of rags, which I don't think really, a title that I don't think fully gives justice to the complexity of some of her work. In both her books and her textile vignettes, she reveals her interest in activism on behalf of a number of social and political causes in the 19th century. These include temperance, the charitable support of injured mariners or their families when they lost someone at sea, female industrial workers, and the abolition of slavery in the United States. Women, of course, did not have the right to vote at the time, so she couldn't pursue her interests in that regard, but she still found public expression for her work. I also want to explore Cleveland's use of caricature to identify social roles and add unexpected and sometimes confounding complexity to the meaning of some of the narratives she presents. Cleveland's work has connections and themes to several galleries that you can see here at PEM today, if you can stay for a few minutes afterwards. And particularly, these include East Union Marine Hall, which my colleague Karina has already mentioned, Salem Stories, a small exhibition on an upper floor, and even the museum's Ropes Mansion. There was a family tie between the Cleveland and the Ropes Mansion, which will be opening, I think, in another week. No, or today. Perhaps it opens today. It's today, actually, that it opens for the season. And of course, we are celebrating American sculpture right now, as Karina has already mentioned, with the Edmonia Lewis exhibition. And this is a type of American sculpture, but in a very different media, that of textiles. So I'm now going to go on. Early impressions. One thing about Lucy's life that is challenging is that her life really survives in fragments. The Phillips Library is the main repository of those. And then in addition to that, there are a number of surviving textile vignettes. There are 10 to 12 of them in total. Some of them are not in good condition. Some are in quite good condition. Some may be a little bit incomplete over the decades of time that they have survived. We also know she created more of them than what I am able to present in my slides today. Some of them may not survive to the present, but I may reference a couple of them here and there. But this is a work. I wanted to have some visual to go along with the early history of her life and her family. Lucy was born into an interesting family, the Hillers, and they were educators, they were makers, they were creative people, they were involved in the public life of Salem and other communities. Lucy was born as the daughter of Joseph Hiller and his wife Margaret Cleveland Hiller, and she was the youngest of their 6 children. There were 5 girls and 1 boy. And Lucy's mother predeceased her husband. Margaret Cleveland died in 1904, so Lucy was still quite a young woman at the time that her mother died, and Major Hiller lived into the 18 teens, dying in his early 60s. And the family lived at various times in Salem, Boston, and Lancaster, Massachusetts. The Clevelands were mariners, navigators, adventurers, collectors, and generally culturally inquisitive individuals. Lucy had an early first marriage to a man named Captain William Lambert of Roxbury, Massachusetts. They married in Boston in 1806, but the marriage sadly lasted only a year because he was a sea captain, and he died while traveling the year after their marriage in August of 1807 in Rotterdam, Holland. And so following his death, Lucy moved back into her family home in Lancaster, Massachusetts. Lancaster is out in the western suburbs. It's a beautiful spot out there, actually. And she took up residence with her two older sisters, Dorcas and Mary, who had married two brothers, Richard Jeffrey Cleveland and William Cleveland, who were also their first cousins. You may have noticed her mother's maiden name was Cleveland. And that was not uncommon with some of the seafaring families and merchant families in Federal period New England. And there's actually a book about demographics that covers that I can recommend. And it was a means at a certain level of consolidating and preserving wealth and influence within certain families. But quite frankly, it also meant that you were marrying someone that you knew and perhaps could trust. When women married in the 18th and 19th century, that had very significant impact on their lives. And so Lucy, her sisters had married these two brothers who were their first cousins. And so I'm going to turn now briefly, and this work is called The New Baby. And this is one of her light-hearted works, where she is exploring the rambunctious, the task of raising rambunctious children. I do think you see her sense of humor coming through in this work, where a mischievous brother is, he has lassoed his sister with a rope, and he has a whip over her head, and she's going to an older adult for some aid, perhaps. But the baby is sleeping quietly in the mother's arms. And so she does explore family life in a number of her works. Lucy's father, Joseph Hiller Sr., who lived from 1748 to 1814, had a very interesting and diverse career, and I think it was a means of having multiple revenue streams in very much tumultuous times. Hiller worked as a silversmith, an engraver, a watch and clock maker. He served in the American Revolution. He led troops from Salem on an expedition to Rhode Island in 1781, and he eventually advanced in rank in the Continental Army to the rank of major over the course of the war. At the end of the war, George Washington appointed Hiller as the first collector of the United States Customs District of Salem and Beverly, Massachusetts, where he served from 1784 to 1803. So he served during both the presidential administrations of George Washington and John Adams. He retired from his post following the election of Thomas Jefferson, and he was abruptly, essentially, he retired, but he also was removed from his post because of the change in the presidential administration. Hiller lived in his later years in Lancaster, Massachusetts, in a brick house and farm purchased by his two sons-in-laws, Richard Jeffrey and William Cleveland, along with their family. So imagine a multi-generational, large, intermingled family out there in a large brick house and farm in Lancaster. Sadly, the house no longer survives. It burned in the late 19th century, or I would have included a picture of it for sure. A Town History of Lancaster, published in 1879, recorded a reminiscence about the Hiller household. And this is a quote from it: "Study, the education of children, discussion of the best methods of training, reading the best book authors, music, a hospitable table, and entertaining conversation filled the day and night in the Hiller household." I do want to point out a couple of the objects here. This is a portrait of Joseph Hiller that hangs in the Customs House here in Salem, and I want to thank them for sharing this image with me. It's a profile portrait of him done in the early years of the 19th century. To his immediate left is a very small object. It's a silver object, so it's part of his silversmith work. It's a nutmeg grater. So it's like a little miniature. It's only about this high. And it's a miniature neoclassical urn in silver that he gave to his wife around the time of their wedding. And then the lower center photograph is that opened up. So you can see the greater part, which is iron, set into the base of the urn. The top opens out the other way so that you can put your single nutmeg and carry it as storage inside the grater. On the upper corner is a gold and carnelian watch fob that was owned by Major Hiller. His one son, Joseph Hiller Jr., did the sketch of George Washington for this, not from life, but copying other known print sources of George Washington. But it was set in gold in London. And George Washington had a big impact on Major Hiller's life. And then finally in the corner is a portrait of John Hancock, the signer of the Declaration of Independence on behalf of Massachusetts. This is Hiller's engraving of John Hancock that is also in the Peabody Essex collection. I'd like to talk now about Lucy's education, fragmentary as it is. I actually haven't found much about the specifics of her education, but the Hillers, and particularly so this is Lucy's father's family, had women in the 18th century who were notable schoolmistresses in Boston. This tablecloth was embroidered by Lucy's aunt, Susanna Hiller Foster, who lived from 1751 to 1822, so this is Major Hiller's sister. And I've included it here with a portrait of her painted by a Boston area artist, Nathaniel Hancock, and it's a miniature portrait. It's actually set into a ring. It's very, very small. And I'm showing a tablecloth that she embroidered and that is in the Peabody Essex collection. Their father, Major Hiller, and his sister Susanna, was the nephew of one of Boston's most renowned schoolmistresses, a woman named Mrs. Susanna Hiller Condy of Boston. A needlework historian, Betty Ring, who wrote a wonderful survey of American needlework, credits Susanna Hiller Condy with being the originator and teacher in the 1740s of both heraldic embroidered coats of arms made in Boston and Boston's pastoral scenes with figures that are often referred to as Boston fishing lady pictures. After her death, after Mrs. Condy's death, her sister-in-law, Abigail Stevens Hiller, advertised a boarding school in the late 1740s that continued into the mid-1750s that taught embroidery, drawing, painting on glass, waxwork, paper filigree, and japanning, which is a lacquer-like technique. And so, though these earlier teachers do not overlap with Lucy's life chronologically, she may have witnessed and seen within the family circles evidence of these types of embroideries and other artwork that were taught to young women in Boston. Other people who may have influenced Lucy's education, and almost certainly influenced them actually, were her mother, Margaret Cleveland Hiller, and also possibly Lucy's older sister, Dorcas. She was 7 years older than Lucy, And these, on the left side, are two surviving works painted by Dorcas. These are miniature portraits. The one on the far left is a mourning piece in the neoclassical style of a weeping woman seated beside a memorial plinth with initials and the date of the death of a loved one. This is painted, it's tiny, it's only about this big, and it's painted on a paper-thin sheet of ivory that is glued to a paper backing and then inset in a gold frame. And this was meant to be probably a locket or a pin that you would carry around in memory of your loved one, and really is a kind of piece of jewelry and a very precious sentimental object. The central is another miniature by Dorcas Hiller, Lucy's sister, an incredibly tiny and beautiful depiction of a mother and child with seated in a landscape with a bird. And the catalog record records that this was painted with macerated hair. So that is human hair ground up and then mixed with a binding agent so that it becomes like paint. And that was a type of memorial technique that was used both in portraits and in some of these scenes. On the far right is an unfinished memorial that Lucy herself did. She was probably not quite as proficient in painting and drawing as her older sister, and it is unfinished. So you can see that she started on the figures, and she was able to accomplish the landscape in the plinth, but she didn't finish the heads for some reason. I don't know why. This is how they survive. But I do think that Dorcas may have had a hand in teaching Lucy some of these techniques. Lucy's also, it's not quite in as good condition. There's a broken piece on the left side, and you can see a little bit of the paper. But these, at this point, it's hard to know how to even touch them. And it doesn't have, this one does not have a frame. So very, very fragile materials. While we're on the topic of memorials, I did want to mention one thing, that the Hiller family did experience a lot of loss as a consequence and often directly related to their maritime activities. I've already noted that Lucy was the youngest of 6 children and that she had 1 brother and 5 sisters. And the Hiller family in the 1790s, in 1795 to be specific, experienced the death of their only son, who was swept overboard and lost at sea near the Cape of Good Hope on a Salem-based ship. Prior to his death, at the age of only about 18, he was very young, he had already shown an aptitude as an engraver, creating that engraved portrait of George Washington for his father's watch fob that I've already spoken about. So he had, his young and promising life was sadly cut short. And this is him. We don't know who painted this, but this is a miniature portrait of Lucy's older brother. I've already mentioned that Lucy was married to a man named Captain Lambert as a very young woman, and then was quickly widowed a year after she married. In 1806, she had married Captain Lambert, and I don't actually know where they lived. Were they in Boston? He was from Roxbury. Maybe they lived there. I'm not sure. But following his death, Lucy moved back to her family home in Lancaster. And she took up residence with her father and her 2 cousins, William and Richard, who owned the house there in Lancaster, and her 2 sisters, Dorcas. This is Dorcas Cleveland, and her husband, Richard, the 2 small portraits. And then on the left is William Cleveland, and this is his portrait by the French artist Saint-Memène, who used a physiognotrace, which is a drawing device to accurately capture the facial features of their subjects. And so this is a profile portrait of Captain Cleveland in probably the first decade of the 19th century. Interestingly, following the family getting consolidated out in Lancaster, Lucy was very likely present during the birth of William and Mary, her older sister. William and Mary married. She was likely present at the birth of her nieces and nephews out in Lancaster. And so she was very likely present as a young widow living with her extended family at the birth of two sons that her sister Mary delivered, along with William Cleveland. And it's an interesting thing that she was there and present. Her sister lived only 2 more years, and she had 3 children in total. Only 2 of them lived to adulthood, and her final birth, she gave birth to, they were all 3 boys, and the final child only lived a short period of time. And her health, Mary's health, may have declined because of the after effects of childbirth. So she died in 1815. The father, Captain Major Hiller, died in 1814. And in 1817, Lucy married her former brother-in-law and first cousin, William. And so that was it was something that was commented on a little bit at the time, but it did happen. And again, it was not as uncommon as we might think today. And so the family remained in Lancaster. William and Lucy, in 1821, returned to Salem. And that's where she lived the rest of her life. This was a very difficult time period in the country, particularly along the coast. So Lucy, her life didn't just span the American Revolution to the American Civil War. There's also the War of 1812 in the middle, and that had serious impact on international maritime trading, which is what the Cleveland brothers were engaged in. William Cleveland and his younger brother, George, both joined the East India Marine Society. George joined first in 1803, shortly after the society was founded in 1799, and the East India Marine Society is the founding organization of the current Peabody Essex Museum. And the hall that we have just reopened after reinstallation and a refurbishment is the original site and home for the East India Marine Society. George Cleveland, William's brother, joined in 1803, so he was a very early member, and William joined in 1821, the year he and Lucy returned back to Salem, because he was going to engage again in maritime trade. The family's fortune, I do have the picture of it being driven by the sort of boom and bust economy of the early 19th century, and it continued on even later. They lived through in the 1830s, one of the largest downturns in the American economy prior to the Great Depression in 1837. So there were times when they had significant affluence, and there were times when they didn't. And so William returned to seafaring. And the brothers were and they made some very important voyages. Both George Cleveland and William, in the first decade of the 19th century, were among a tiny handful of Salem ships that, under the auspices of the Dutch East India Company, they went and traded in Japan, and they brought back some of the earliest Japanese collections that we have here, with this brought back by American sea captains, which was 50 years prior to the opening of Japan to the West in the 1850s. And so they brought back some very unique objects, and I have a few of them here in my slide. They also traded in China and in Indonesia, and I'm going to talk about one particular voyage in greater detail about that. Richard Jeffrey Cleveland, the oldest brother, he never joined the East India Marine Society. I don't really know why, and I don't really want to speculate, but he also was a sea captain, and he authored a very important book about the international maritime trade in the American federal period. It's called A Narrative of Voyages and Commercial Enterprises, that still remains of interest to historians today. So he recounted in detail where they were trading in India, how they got there, how they established trade relationships, and so that's also remains of interest in the the study of the history of international trading. Some of these objects, almost all of the objects that I'm showing you here are on view right now upstairs in East India Marine Hall. So we have a sandal that was acquired in 1803, made of silk, straw, and cotton. This was the gift of William Cleveland in 1803, so he donated this to what is now the Peabody Essex Museum. There is, let's see, the next one next to the sandal, so the center bottom image was made by an artist in Africa or in Brazil, and it's a musical instrument used by slaves at Rio de Janeiro, probably brought by them from the west coast of Africa. And this was donated in 1830 by Lucy Cleveland to the East India Marine Society. And then a musical instrument from China. William Cleveland later visited China. He donated this instrument in 1803. And then finally, a model, the upper right, is a model of an irrigation machine that was made in Shanghai, China, and William donated that object in 1831. I should mention one of the things, and you can see this in in the upper right, this is our recently reinstalled exhibition on the East India Marine Hall. The mariners, they had a number of purposes with this organization. One was navigation. They were literally gathering records of how to do trade and how to sail ships to places that American mariners had never visited before. They kept records of this. Their log books were put into a library. So William Cleveland and George Cleveland's log books are in the Phillips Library here at the museum. They also collected objects of all kinds, and they put them in a cabinet of curiosity. And in the sort of center back, you can see one of the original wooden cabinets. These were mementos of all their voyages. They collected natural history specimens, cultural objects, art objects, everyday life objects, and they brought them back and put them on display. And they opened their cabinet of curiosities to the general public so people could learn about what they were doing and where they were going and see some of these incredible objects. They also had a philanthropic purpose in that they also raised funds to support families who lost mariners at sea, who had lost heads of households, other family members, or injured sailors who might have been out of work for a long period of time, or perhaps injured permanently. So that was another part of their purpose in coming together as an organization. I'm going to turn now to, I'm calling it a new chapter. So Lucy's now back in Salem, and she has young children. She has her nephews / stepsons living in the household with her, two boys. And so she begins her first major form of expression, which is to write children's books. And she published all of these anonymously. So, so this is the Black Velvet Bracelet. This is a second edition. It was originally published in the late 1820s. This is a second edition. And these are very moralistic tales. They're meant to help parents cultivate behavioral practices within their family circles. So this particular book is about a young girl who cannot control her temper, and often expresses it at her younger brother and that kind of thing. So they are very moralistic tales, but they do reveal some of the high points and low points of these maritime families. Long hours of waiting for someone to return from a voyage, or confronting profound sorrow when someone doesn't return ever. And so they're an interesting mix. It's sometimes surprising what she writes about in her children's books. They often have a single plate. Lucy may have had a hand in sketching. I don't know whether she did the original drawing for this or not. The publisher probably had a sketch of some kind developed into a plate that could be printed. And then the opening chapter, and these are some images I took just a few weeks ago in the Phillips Library. She published over 10, maybe as many as a dozen books that are from the late 1820s through into the 1840s. They get longer, they're more developed, and they have more visual presence over time. So this is 1829. This is a book called The Closet, and it has on the front a beautiful cover with late classical ornamentation of anthemions and columns and such. And then on the back cover, it shows the publishing house with this wonderful illustration of Lucy's publishers, Bowles and Dearborn in Boston. This is, if you open the cover of the book, this is what you see. And so the Essex Institute, this was donated around 1900 by someone called Miss Lucy H. Cleveland. That is Lucy's granddaughter. That's not Lucy. She was named after Lucy Cleveland. And she and her sister donated a lot of Cleveland materials. But you see, in this copy, Lucy has signed her name, and I'm sure that's her signature because there are a lot of handwritten documents in the Phillips Library. But I want to show you a couple of other things. I do want to note that on the Essex Institute kind of bookplate there, if you flip it up, Lucy's calling card is glued underneath that. But in the back of several of her books in the Phillips Library collection, this is the copyright certificate. So we wouldn't know that these were Lucy's, that she's the author, except that the copyright certificates are glued into the back of the book. And this shows the copyright certificate for The Closet, and with a lot of flourishes there, and it's signed. And then in handwriting on the back of the left document, it's folded, and this is glued into the back of the book, so it's really hard to open it. But it says, copyright of The Closet, December 8th, 1828. We hereby transfer to Mrs. Cleveland their copy of the copyright. So they're transferring to Lucy Cleveland her own copyright on these books, Bowles and her publishers there. And so this is really some of the prime documentation. The early copyright records, some of them survive and go back a long, long time, but some of them are missing in the history of copyright. And now I want to go to Sculpted by Needle and look at her textile works. There are 10 to a dozen or so of her surviving textile works, these doll-like figures. When I first started my research, quite frankly, in my first papers and lectures, I was really trying to prove to the world that these are not just dolls. They are not just playthings. They are much more serious than that, and they're historical documents that are much more interesting, and sometimes interesting in unexpected ways. This is one of her earliest works. It's called The Sick Chamber. It's probably from right around 1830, and it's a depiction of an elderly woman lying in bed. Presumably her spouse is seated in the wing chair beside her. There are two adult women who are clearly discussing the treatment of the person who is ill, and then a servant standing at the foot of the bed. And I wanted to call out a few things. Lucy was a very astute observer, and she also was very particular about what textiles she used to convey visual information silently to the people who would have recognized where these textiles came from, and distinguishing between characters, between inside and outside, between roles, so to speak, of how these vignettes, they really are stories, just like her books, but they're like a freeze frame, one episode in a storyline. And this is really clearly a family struggling to care for elderly relatives. You can see how the faces are made. She had a very distinctive way of creating faces, stuffing them. Some of them are cotton, some of them are leather. She used real human hair for some of these. Others of these, she used wool and other materials for the hair. But even the elderly gentleman, who is probably a sea captain, he's wearing a plaid, a madras plaid fabric, and that in a dressing gown, and he could have been involved in the India trade. At the time in Salem, people would have read the materials as contributing to the understanding of the identity of the people. And you can see how carefully she kind of sculpted with her materials, the faces, the hands. The bed has white draperies. It could be a dimity or some of the other white cottons that were being brought back from India. The floor is Venetian carpeting. It's a type of carpeting that was used in bedrooms and on stairways in Salem homes at the time period, and that's an actual piece of Venetian carpeting that she has cut up and used. I would like to note that my colleague, George Schwartz, a fellow curator at large here at Peabody Essex, generously shared with me a reference about the sick chamber that I want to share with you with his permission this morning. George wrote a book on the East India Marine Society that's very current. It was published just several years ago after he completed his PhD, and he's one of the co-curators of the current installation in East India Marine Hall. And so he was looking at all known images of the building and its interior and how that changed over time. And he came across a sketch by an artist named Arthur Stone of East India Marine Hall in the 1890s. It has a little key on the far left side that has names of just a small number of the works, but there's the arrow that I have added on top of that sketch points to a case in East India Marine Hall, and the other side it points to the name of the work, and it's the sick chamber. So this is Lucy Cleveland's in a little wooden box. Her sick chamber was displayed in East India Marine Hall. It's sadly not on display in the current installation because it's really very fragile at this point. And then I wanted to also make note of one thing. I'm sorry this is a little blurry. This is a crop out of the overall image of the sick chamber. But this is the woman, the elderly woman in the bed, and I wanted you to take a look at the printed coverlet because so that I can link it to another object, which is this. This is a palampore. These are Indian export textiles. They were luxury textiles in the 18th and early 19th century. And this is a palampore in the Peabody Essex collection, and it was owned by the Cleveland family. I don't know whether it was owned by William and Lucy or his brother. I'm not sure about that, but it was donated along with other things by the descendants of the Cleveland family. And this dates from the late 1820s. It is composed of Indian textiles, trade textiles, on both the front and the back. The front has a large-scale tree of life, beautifully dye-painted by hand in India, and then these scallop borders. It has been cut because they fitted it to a four-post bed. These T-shaped quilts were used on four-poster beds. But on the back side, it has a second Indian export, Textile, which is a block-printed floor cloth. These are pretty rare. And the other thing that's interesting about the Cleveland quilted Palampore is that it was almost certainly quilted here in New England. The family probably did it themselves. Because it has pinwheels and scallopy designs, all the kinds of things that New England women were quilting here. And some tape around the edges, some other materials that look like they are produced in this country rather than in India. So I just wanted to show that as a comparison. These are quite glorious textiles. They have some wonderful details of peacocks and animals. She also did a quilting scene herself. This is an unusual one. It's quite small. It has 4 figures seated in ladder-back chairs, and they're quilting away at making a quilt stretched over a frame. The heads of these are unusual. These do not have the fabric or leather faces. They have hickory nut heads. So they're kind of in a more folk-like genre, I would say, but it does depict quilters at work. This is the piece that you may have seen in some of the promotion of this lecture. This is another example of one of her lighter-hearted scenes. It's the old lady who lived, there was an old lady who lived in a shoe, which was a common nursery rhyme at the time. And the second line of that is, there was an old lady who lived in a shoe. She had so many children, she didn't know what to do. And so this is showing an adult woman in a shoe, which is very much like an actual shoe of the 1830s. And Lucy has made all of these tiny children. There's a pair of identical twins here poking out of the toe of the shoe in the detail. And on the far right side, there's actually one child who didn't quite fit and has fallen out and is clinging desperately to the right side of the shoe. Unfortunately, I couldn't find an image of that. But she is, again, working with scenes related to childhood, but some of these lighthearted moments in her work. This is another work. This is a work that is entitled The Foot Bath or the Second Wife. Now, Lucy was a second wife, so I'm not sure whether this has a more personalized reference to her own circumstances as a middle-aged or older woman, but again, she has returned to the theme of caring for family members in a home domestic setting. So there is a woman who's carrying a bottle and a red bandage. Red wool were used as bandages in the early 19th century. There is a black woman in the center. I find it interesting that she is the figure who makes eye contact with the viewer. The other two are they're at odds with each other in a way. And then the older man, who is, I think, more the patient. He's the one who's being tended here by the two women. And I'm going to come back to the black figure in the center because this is a topic that is of a lot of interest to me right at the moment, how to understand. Lucy, I think there are 4 of her works that have black men and women in them, and it's complicated, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But here again, there are references to interiors and exteriors, to how families cared for their relatives in their homes. And now I'd like to look a bit at Lucy's portrayal of black citizens. Salem, of course, had a significant Black community that dates back to the to the 17th century, but more is known about the 18th century and the 19th century, particularly after the formation of the United States when they began to take census records. And then Salem also has early they were on the earlier end of publishing city directories where they list people by name and their street address and that kind of thing. So we can find out more information about the members of the Black community in the 19th century. And there's been a lot of research on the history of the Black community in Salem in the last couple of decades or more, and it's constantly revealing new episodes and narratives that complicate the idea that slavery was abolished in Massachusetts in the 1780s, which on one level happened, but that the advocacy for the abolition of slavery and equal rights were ongoing well into the 19th century, and particularly here in a place like Salem. There are times when Lucy's work, both in her writings and in a bit in her textiles, appears to be somewhat sympathetic and supportive of the abolition of slavery, and she does express those views, particularly in her books. But her work also reveals racist stereotypes and a limited and biased view of individuals in the Black community in Salem and New England. To be fair to Lucy, she does use caricature and cartoon-like depictions of many of her subjects in her stories. She also closely observed Black men and women, as well as white members of the community. In terms of the clothing, she had a keen eye for detail. She clearly, I've already talked about how she chose certain textiles to convey identity and distinguish roles between the characters in her works. But so far, and not all of Lucy's works survive. There are some that are mentioned that I don't know, mentioned in written documents where I simply don't know whether they survive elsewhere. But all of her works, surviving works, do present Black people in various forms of servitude, and they are lacking in the full humanity and individualism of the figures. We can only speculate, really, about the motivation behind these omissions and perhaps their inherent biases, but it is important to note that they are present in the light of contemporary scholarship. And so I have rounded up four of the figures from four different vignettes. The figure from the sick chamber is on the far left. The full-length figure of the woman is from the foot bath and the second wife. I'll come back in a moment to the full-length figure of a man. This is free, probably dated to the time of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. So this is really right out at the end of Lucy's life, just a couple of years before she died. And then finally, another work that's called The Letter. And you can see how the people are portrayed. I'm including this because this is another artist, George Ropes, and this is his Salem Common on Training Day. And I did want to note, in contrast to Lucy, there are other artists who were portraying and integrating members of the Black community in their works. This is on view in On This Ground, Being and Belonging in America, and it's a scene of the local militia parading on Salem Common, but in the foreground there's this amazing band of local citizens with booths, kind of like a fair almost, with people selling food and drink, and then people promenading in front of it. But there are African American figures included in the groupings that are on the lower edge of this painting. And if I'd encourage you, On This Ground, Being and Belonging is just outside the door of the auditorium here, so you can go and see this painting after the talk today if you haven't seen it before. I'm going to turn back now to the maritime aspects. This is a work called Sailor's Home. This is an injured, possibly disabled mariner, a sailor. He's wearing a check shirt and a tarred hat. That is a kind of signature garment for sailors in the 19th century. He also has a bundle handkerchief wrapped around his belongings that are tied to a stick so he can carry that. And he has in his shirt is open, and there's a little red piece of fabric coming out. That is a silk bandana handkerchief from India. And so that's another reference to maritime trading. But this really is a depiction of the harsh life at sea. And Cleveland created this vignette to advocate for charitable relief of injured or disabled mariners. And the figure is probably looking for a sailor's Bethel, or even a place like the East India Marine Society that was known for financially helping sailors and mariners who could not work temporarily or permanently, and address the plight of their needs. Now I'd like to take an even deeper dive into Lucy's engagement with the sea. Because, in 1828, William Cleveland, he had been engaged in the pepper trade, so he was going to Indonesia on a number of voyages in the 1820s, and then sometimes on to China, so that he would, his ship would collect things like sandalwood that he would then bring to China and trade for all the Chinese goods that they were bringing back, silks and tea and that kind of thing, and then they would come back to bring them back to New England. But this is a sea journal, Journal of the Voyage from Salem toward Timor, one of the islands in what is today Indonesia. The ship Zephyr, it's named for a type of wind. A zephyr is a type of wind. And this is a voyage begun on November 18th, 1828, and that returned and kept. This volume was kept through September 29th, 1829, and it was filled out largely by Augustus Allen, who signed it on the cover. And it records day-by-day accounts of the sea voyage. For whatever reason, Lucy Cleveland, and at least their son James, and possibly both sons, went with William Cleveland on this voyage. She was in her late 40s, and she was just about 50 years old by the time they returned 2 years later. And there were only a small number of women in Salem who went with their sea captain husbands on these types of voyages at this early time period. There are quite a number more in the second half of the 19th century, but the ones that from the 1820s are very few. They sailed on the ship Zephyr. It was built in Middletown, Connecticut in 1815. It was 110 feet long and 27 feet wide, and it had a depth of 13 feet 6 inches. The logbook and Lucy's passport are in the collection of the Phillips Library here at the Peabody Essex Museum. And it's a very interesting thing to see this. In addition to this logbook, Lucy also kept a sketchbook. I wouldn't say drawing was really her best artistry. I think she actually was more accomplished in her sewing skills. But she did have the capacity to draw, and so she kept a sketchbook that has both pencil sketches and watercolor. And she also kept a written diary. And we learned some things from these records that Lucy kept that we wouldn't know otherwise, really, in the logbook kept by the men on the ship. And so this is showing getting sandalwood from the island of Timor in a small place called Dula, where they stopped in 1830. And Lucy does identify, the inscription is hard to read here, but she does identify some of the people in the image. The man seated at the base of the tree in a red jacket, he is the governor of that settlement. And the boy with the umbrella is James, the Cleveland son. So there may be a few instances where she's depicting her own family here in the midst of the scenes. So they are loading sandalwood logs into a small rowboat, and then they're going to row them out to the Zephyr, and then the Zephyr will go on to its next port. And then Lucy, at all of these ports, some of them are the Portuguese trading ports in Indonesia. Some of them are have colonial settlements of other European nations. She encounters types of watercraft she'd never seen before, an outrigger canoe. She encountered lifeways that were very different. These are more sandalwood. And men and women. On the upper right, they have sandalwood there, but they also have betel nuts. In that scene, some of the East India Marine Society captains would bring back samples of some of these elements of the natural world and put them on display here in Salem at the end of their voyages. Here we have Europeans or Americans. The upper left is the governor, the British governor of one of the settlements they visited, being carried in a hammock by two indigenous residents of the same place. I am unclear on this other right-hand scene whether this is a missionary couple because of a cross-like figure in the background, or whether this could be Lucy and William and James again. I'm not sure. But in any case, they are encountering residents in Indonesia, and Lucy's making a record of this. And her journal also has descriptive passages about ports, places, goods. She also records some very poignant incidents about the difficulties of life on board ship. And that included the loss of some of their sailors. I'm going to read you one short passage here. Lucy almost certainly had a hand in tending sick mariners, including her husband. William is recorded as being ill for time. But I'm going to read you a couple of short passages about some of the other crew members. This is in August of 1829. They are off the coast of Indonesia. Thursday morning, August 20th, Cornelius Thompson complained that he was a little unwell and had been chilly in the night watch. He was, however, so indisposed as to propose going in the boat after Sandalwood, but Mr. C., so that's William Cleveland, accidentally hearing that he was not well, inquired into his case. Before he went away, intending to be safe and cautious, he gave him a powerful dose of calomel and a syrup, which afterward was followed by a dose of castor oil and numerous injection blisters upon the calves of both legs after soaking them well in hot water. And then he also had a blister on his throat, rubbed with liniment. He complained of no pain, if you can imagine what I just read, except for a headache. And at first he seemed relieved, but returned with equal violence on Friday morning. And later he became delirious, and a short time afterward he appeared to fail. And then later on, she also recorded that he fell into a gentle sleep with easy breathing, but this soon turned to a stupor, and nothing could interrupt him until 4 o'clock the following morning. His illness was the shortest and most deceptive, and has the most affective providence to us all. He was correct and an amiable, respectful, and very handsome young man, always ready at his duty, cheerful and obliging. He had gained upon our affections very sharply. On Wednesday evening, he was dancing happily on the forecastle, and on Sunday at 8 in the morning, he was carried on shore and buried. So there were some trials along the way during the voyage. Lucy, on August, just a little bit later, she writes that she trusts she has seen Indonesia for the last time. I think it was proving a real strain on all of the people on the voyage, these illnesses. This is the destination, the next destination. It's the island of Macau, which is off the coast of China. This is a scene in the Peabody Essex collection painted in 1824. So this is where they were headed. And their purpose in landing at Macau was to get permission for William to go on to Guangzhou, or what was called Canton at the time. And he had to have formal governmental permission to go to his ultimate destination. And so Lucy had arranged to stay with these folks. This is William and Abigail Lowe and their niece, Harriet Lowe. And they are from Salem. William was involved with one of the Boston China trade merchant houses, Russell and Company. And so the Lowes were staying on the island of Macau. And their young niece, Harriet, came and stayed with them. She wrote letters back to her younger sister that are almost like a diary, and provide a lot of information about these merchant families living on the island of Macau. So the women could stay there. The women could not set foot on mainland China. They were forbidden from doing that. And so Harriet stays with them, and they leave records of Lucy's visits, what they did during the day. They did sightseeing. She played the guitar for them in the evening. And so it's an interesting thing that this account also includes information about Lucy's trip. This is a scene of Guangzhou, a panorama of the city, and on the foreground, you can see all of those kind of light-colored buildings along the wharves. Those were the trading houses of the European and American merchants. So this is the place that William went to drop off the sandalwood and then select goods to bring back to Salem. Lucy, in January of 1830, in her journal, she wrote, "After passing nearly 3 months very charmingly at Macau in the family of my kind and hospitable friend, Mrs. Lowe, from whom it has been truly hard parting, I embarked this morning about 11 o'clock on my passage toward home." Perkins Higginson, with her husband and James, who had joined her on shore recently, went in the boat to the ship, and then the ship launched, and they were on their return voyage. When Lucy got back, the voyage became part of her creative process, and so she first of all wrote a book called The Adventures of Wilson Avery. It's a book about a young boy who is the son of a sea captain who goes with his father on a voyage to all the places that Lucy had just visited. So she is fictionalizing some of her own experiences. They go to some of the exact same places that are listed in her journal and in the Zephyr's journal, but along the way, she has an episode in which the sea captain and his son and all the sailors witness an enslaved Malay boy. So he's Indonesian, and who was being very badly treated and was being sold into slavery. And so they offer to take the boy, and he joins the crew. The sailors dress him, and he comes back to Salem with them. He finds placement with an older couple in Salem, and this is her depiction of this episode that she also writes about in her books. It's one of the only places where you see her writings and her textile vignettes absolutely come together as having a common source of inspiration. And this is a detail of the Malay boy. Of course, he, in leaving, would have given up kind of force given up by his circumstances initially, but and then coming here, it would have been a process of assimilation into New England culture and dress, but potentially never seeing his relatives again. So it's a very poignant but very troubling story, I think, on a lot of different levels. But it is in both her children's book and in this figure. This is the last, I think, yes, this is, I have only one more vignette after this, but this is one of the last ones where there is a direct reference to that voyage. This is a scene, it was, the museum acquired this actually as a museum purchase from a New England auction house a number of years ago, and we don't know exactly where it came from. It came with a letter, with a piece of correspondence that said the title of it is The Letter, but there isn't a letter in the scene, and there actually is a different vignette that has the title The Letter. So I've never been convinced that the letter and that came with this vignette goes with this particular scene. What I think is happening is, I think this is actually one of Lucy's other reform movement interests. I think this is a temperance scene. And this appears to be a sea captain wearing a banyan, which is like a dressing gown, made out of Indonesian batik from Java. And it's miniature batik. I don't know where she found some of these textiles or whether she brought them back, but he is wearing a reference to international maritime trade. But he has in his mouth a rose. And he also has a bottle that's standing upright and a cup, and she has a basket. She looks decidedly unhappy, and I think there's there's real friction in the scene with perhaps inebriated sea captain who is engaging with a family member, and again, a black woman who was probably a servant of one or both of these individuals. But this is a very rare reference, and I think that this is what made it particularly of interest, to find these trade textiles being used in her work after the voyage that she took. And then finally, this is probably the latest work that currently survives. This is Lucy's vignette, or her statue, really, called Free. And it is probably dated to around the time of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. I can't say that for sure, but it seems like it might be likely. She was known to have had her faculties. 1863, she died in 1866, so she is well into her 80s. And she was still creating these things occasionally at the time. But I think it draws a reference. This is a print by an artist named Stephen Henry Gimber after Alexander Rippengil. It's called Emancipation. It's from 1834. It's a mezzotint, and it's in the Peabody Essex collection. And this was a mezzotint that was used and distributed by the American Anti-Slavery Office in New York City to celebrate the abolition of slavery in Great Britain in 1834 and to promote the abolition of slavery here in the United States. Lucy was certainly aware of visual culture of many different kinds, and this is something that she may well have seen and may have had a hand in inspiring the pose, the gesture of the raised arms, and then he's holding in his hand a symbol of the oppression of slavery. It's a whip, a knotted whip. His arm is bandaged, his head is bandaged. So I'm going to end here with this particular piece. I'm going to return here to Lucy. This is a carte de visite, small photograph from around 1865. It shows her right at the end of her life. And it was taken by D.W. Bowden, who was an early photographer here in Salem. So we know this was taken in Salem. So I just want to wrap up and say that, research is always ongoing. Because I'm talking about this probably, let me just think, 90s. Revisiting research is an interesting experience because the world has been being digitized we're 20 years on now of digitization of records, and it's so interesting to see things now online that back when I started the research would have required multiple trips to multiple libraries, some of them in Boston, to come up with the same information. Even having the Salem directories and census and all these genealogical kind of records that people are so interested in available online, it's just opening. It's such an expansive world now for doing any kind of research. And it's been a pleasure to revisit this, rethink some of the impact of her work during her lifetime, but also what it means to us today. I think in some ways she does capture what was going on in Salem and in her own family circle in an interesting way, but I do think it's shared within the larger community. But there are some places where it's hard to get a clear read on Lucy Cleveland as well. So there remains, I think there remains ample opportunity to do more research on her and her family in the future. So I'll just end with that. Thank you. I did want to say I'm happy if anyone wants to go and see. I'm happy to take a few questions first, but I'm also happy to walk up to Salem Stories and point out her one work that's on display. And then also be sure East Indian Marine Hall is very close by. They're adjoining galleries. So if you're interested in going and seeing the installation that we've talked about this morning, it's certainly available, and we'd love for you to see it today. And then I do want to mention, as Karina has already mentioned, because we're talking about sculpture today, the wonderful Edmonia Lewis exhibition that is here at PEM for just a little while longer, and then we'll travel to its co-organizer in Georgia at the Georgia Museum of Art. Any questions? Yes.
So, just one sec.
Oh, yes. Just a microphone so that your question can be heard.
So why would she have published anonymously? What's the story there? And then I think you mentioned that, on her trip and where she came back and created both the sculptural work and the narrative to go with it. I think you said these were fictional. So was the Malay, young man who came back, did he really exist, or was he a fictional figure?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I don't see I haven't come across a record in the logbook and Lucy's journal about that. So I don't know the extent. But I did want to just trace that the places that she recounts in the Adventures of Wilson Avery, that they definitely parallel what she's writing about in her journal as well as the ship logbook. Not necessarily the sequencing of them, but just the place names. Which seems to suggest that she's fictionalizing the actual experiences of being on a voyage. And it's hard to tell with her other works, when she's talking about domestic life, how much she's talking about her own experiences, or is she witnessing this in the community of neighbors and that kind of thing. She doesn't call that out. To go back to your first question, there were a number of women authors who, for whatever reason, did not publish under their own names. They may have felt that, Lucy, her husband, I think she privileged her husband and his career in a certain way and wanted to give him the attention and perhaps her father ahead of him, because they were accomplished and and wanted to give the recognition there, or perhaps she, I'm not sure exactly. There are many more women authors. There are women authors who are publishing under their own names, but she was not among them. She chose not to for a personal reason that I've not seen her write about. But it's not unknown at that time period. I think it's kind of modesty and the role of the different roles that women have thought about in the world. They were a religious family. That sometimes plays into that as well. So I'm not sure, but that's what she did. Yes.
I'm curious where she would have exhibited her vignettes.
Well, that's a very good question, and I'm happy to answer that. And I'm not sure I called this out as quite as emphatically as I intended to, but Lucy used the vignettes. She displayed them. In the early 19th century and in the years leading up to the American Civil War, this was a great age of charitable fairs, often organized by women, or women and men, and some even men's organizations, like the mechanics organizations, where they would be displaying their wares. And Lucy is known to have displayed her vignettes at charitable fairs, and then she would allow them to be sold at auction, so people would buy them. And it's possible, actually, that the sickbed was sold at a fair at Hamilton Hall, actually, one of the earliest known in Salem, and then bought by George Crowninshield, I think, is the donor to the East India Marine Society. So it may have had a previous transaction related to that. And so by doing that, she is allowing the organizations who are focused on these reform movement causes, temperance, the relief of sailors, abolition. She did one called The Shirt Woman. That was for women industrial workers in New York City. And so, and as her family traveled around, there's one certificate about one of her figures that was displayed in New York's, upstate New York. In Syracuse, New York, actually. And some of them may have actually been sent to other places, carried by family members, to be exhibited at charitable fairs. Probably the best known, the sanitary fairs, which a lot of women in northern states during the Civil War, they were gathering bandages and funds and supplies to send to service members in the Union Army. That's another example of charitable fairs. But they happened a lot in Boston, and they happened here in Salem. They happened on behalf of educational opportunities to widen that. So that's a very interesting topic. And I wrote about that more in some of my articles, particularly the Dublin Seminar article, going into that in more detail. Her life goes in a lot of different directions. That's what it makes talking about her a little bit of a challenge. And she did have a long life in a very complicated time.
Do you know of works in other public institutions?
I think there may be one at the Shelburne Museum in Vermont. I've corresponded with them before. I have a whole folder of what I call pseudo-Cleveland vignettes. There were other people who made doll-like figures, including like the old lady who lived in a shoe. That some people made that by taking an actual shoe and filling it with little dolls. We have an example of that in the Peabody Essex collection. There were other people who made cloth figures that look like Lucy's, but she had a certain, I call it her hand. There's something about them that when I see them, how the faces are created. She painted the faces, she stitched them. They have wood skeletons, so they have whittled sticks of wood around which she wrapped cotton batting, and then the skin, so to speak, which is usually either a cotton fabric or leather, and then how the hair is done, the eyes. Some of her, a number of her figures, these beautifully modeled faces, the pupils of the eye have a single tiny glass bead in it, so it reflects light and gives it a more lifelike, I think, character to the figures. I didn't read, there's one thing there was a woman's magazine author, Eliza Leslie, who also wrote cookbooks. She was known as a cookbook author in the late 19th century. She visited the East India Marine Hall and saw the sickbed. And this is what she wrote about it. The Lady of Salem has represented the miniature interior of a bedchamber and furnished it with a little needlework carpet, an easy chair, a bed, and the nicest little curtains, pillow sheets, counterpane. In the bed lies a sick lady, and the tiny frills of her nightgown and nightcap plaited as if by fairy fingers. She is dangerously ill, as is apparent in her pale and hollow cheeks and the glazed and dying look of her eyes. Beside her in the chair sits her husband, an old gentleman whose countenance and posture denote exceeding grief. These figures, none of them are more than a foot high. All have been cut out, stuffed, and sewed into the most admirable resemblance of human form and face, and with such consummate skill and exquisite neatness that it is difficult to comprehend how so nice a process could be accomplished with such perfect success. So her craftsmanship in her work, I think, was something that did catch people's eyes, and that really distinguishes Lucy's from others. And I as I say, I have these, I call them the pseudo Cleveland vignettes. They just don't have that exacting production that I just read about from a period source. Yes. Oh, yes. If you could just repeat your question into the microphone, that would be a big help.
So she never had biological children of her own?
She did not. She didn't. But you wouldn't, having probably been present with the two boys of her second husband and her older sister, the younger of the two of them, so there's correspondence that survives from them to Lucy. She wrote poems about them in her later life and such, but they had a nickname for her, Marm. And a lot of people, that could be your biological mother, or it could be a nickname for someone, but you really wouldn't know that they are not her biological children. And she lived William Cleveland predeceased her by many years. He died in 1842, she died in 1866. She lived in the house where they had lived together for a period of time, but at the end of her life, she ended up living with William Sewell Cleveland, the older of the two boys, on Lafayette Street in a house that he had there. And so that's where her life was ended.
So I think Paula will accompany anybody who has time to go up to see Lucy's work in person. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Paula.
Yes, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your interest. I appreciate it.